All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining the introduction to Kubernetes Conformance presented to you by the members of the work group. I'm William Dennis, Product Manager on Google Kubernetes Engine and a co-chair of the working group. We have a bunch of stickers. Make sure you grab one before you leave. So, Certified Kubernetes. Certified Kubernetes is a software conformance program for Kubernetes that vendors can run a test suite, an end-to-end test suite that tests out a whole bunch of different functionality in the cluster and certify their products as conformant. Why we're doing this is three main reasons. The first and most important is portability and interoperability. So I'm sure you've seen a lot already today and at the keynote just how important the open source part of Kubernetes is and just how important it is to have interop between all the different versions of Kubernetes. I thought CERN had a really good example. They said they played public cloud bingo, where they tried to get as many public clouds as they could connected to their Kubernetes federation. And I think they got 7 in just a day. That only works if we have portability and interoperability. And I think it's really important that as a community we maintain that, which is kind of the reason that this entire thing exists. Next up is predictability. So this is kind of looking ahead into the future where Kubernetes may actually diverge a little bit into different use cases. As a work group, one of the items that we have on our agenda for the future is making sure that if Kubernetes does diverge a little bit, and if there are kind of legitimate but separate use cases, that we have a way we can highlight that to users so they know what they're getting. They know what the differences are if they're using kind of Kubernetes flavor A or flavor B. That's something for the future, but it's something that we're very much planning to handle. Finally is upgrade assurances. So here we are at KubeCon with a whole bunch of contributors, a whole bunch of engineers and product managers and people that have been working really hard at building out Kubernetes itself. And we want to make sure that when you go home next week, you can actually use those really great new features that everyone has been working so hard to deliver. And so that's where the upgrade assurances come in. So one of the key tenets of the program is that participants actually need to ship updated versions of Kubernetes reasonably regularly. That doesn't mean that you have to upgrade if you're a user. It just means that the vendor needs to provide an up-to-date version. If they fail to do that, then they actually will get decertified, which doesn't mean that they're no longer conformant to the now obsolete tests. It just means that they can no longer show the certified Kubernetes badge and claim that certification. So the process itself consists of kind of two equal components. The first is the Kubernetes community. They have always been the ones that defined what Kubernetes was, what Kubernetes is, and what it should be. And they continue to do that. They also build, and it's actually a SIG special interest group, SIG architecture, who kind of owns that, but it's really the community's definition. The community also builds open source tests to test the various features of Kubernetes. And we're expecting that particularly new features of Kubernetes should have some kind of conformance whatever the implication of conformance is, captured in a test suite as part of that feature. And then the distributions and platforms and also the users can run the conformance test suite to validate conformance. Then we have the CNCF Foundation and this work group. And where we come in, where the CNCF comes in is they operate the certification process. And this work group, our work group, defines what that process is. So distributions and platforms that pass those community-defined conformance tests are then invited to submit their results for certification. Like I said, users can also run those tests, so it's very easy for them to verify that the vendor is actually conformant should they wish. And finally, the CNCF also enforces the trademark policy, which is very important, and Dan will talk more about that shortly, and just all the other kind of aspects of the program. All right, with that, I would like to turn it over to Dan from the CNCF to talk a little bit more about their role in this process.
Yeah, thank you. So I've been involved in different software certification programs, and I've certainly read about a ton of them, but this one is actually pretty unique, where we kicked it off exactly a year ago. We had a keynote meeting in Berlin, and it was shockingly non-controversial through the process, and I kept sort of expecting it to get derailed, and there were people saying, oh, this person's going to try and interfere with it or not really support it, and it's just amazing to see all of the vendors, all of the biggest players in this space back it, and now to get support from everyone. So we have 55 certified Kubernetes partners, which is really a little crazy. I mean, when you go through historically and say, how often have you been able to get all of the biggest players and really having no one standing out? And so if you saw my keynote this morning, you can know that I never resist the chance to show off the interactive landscape. And one of the things that we've added into it, if I go here, it's an example one, certified Kubernetes, and then I'm going to do, and that command plus is working. Let me just see if I can zoom in up here. You remap command? Control, yeah. Thank you. One of those high maintenance computer users. And then I'm just going to go in here to category, and I'm going to unclick the bottom and add in non-certified. In fact, I'll show you the paths as well. So you can see here that we have 34 distributions, and one of the fun things about this is the ability to click in and see, oh, look, Joyent, here's the funding they've received, and their first commit on this is a year ago, and their last commit is this week, and we can see all of this relevant detail about it, including some tweets and such, or like Rancher just came out with Rancher, their GA for Rancher 2.0 today. And then we have all the hosted platforms here, and white is open source and gray is closed source. And then we just recategorized this a couple weeks ago and created a new category we call installers. So distribution is trying to make more of a choice about what software it's bundling it with in terms of the offering, and then installer is just downloading vanilla Kubernetes from GitHub and then installing it onto you. And of course there's still detailed steps involved in it. So the non-certified Kubernetes, there's literally 7 here, and I know that at least 5 of these are underway. It's just been other priorities. They're not in any sort of meaningful way trying to diverge from it. And like Huawei, one of their platforms is certified. They just haven't quite gotten around to this other one, but they very much plan to. And then the part that's also been interesting as we keep updating this landscape over time is this PaaS container service section keeps shrinking down because so many of the folks that used to be on here have re-architected their platforms onto Kubernetes. I will say that no code will definitely be the last one left here as our kind of Easter egg in the space. Okay, I think that's everything that I would say. I am available afterwards or on the mailing list or to help out.
Can you hear me? Okay. So there are a number of conformance tests that existed inside the upstream test suite. We've been working on the upstream test suite since Epoch. Originally, it was a bunch of bash scripts kind of cobbled together, and then over time, people looped in, and we decided to make a behavioral-driven testing framework. And the idea originally was that I originally worked at Red Hat and OpenShift, and we needed a means by which we could have a single unified test suite that we could execute against a Kubernetes that would be stood up in a different environment. Right? And over time, this kind of morphed and evolved, and then we started to have the idea of conformance. So a lot of this is built into the end-to-end testing apparatus, but the UX is very difficult for most people. There's a single container that's published by Upstream called a kubetest container, and it's basically the raw way you could run the tests. So one thing that I've had in multiple experiences in my lifetime is just because you create something doesn't mean that a user will understand it or make it easy for them. So the purpose of Sonobuoy from the conformance perspective is to make it easily to consume from any provider or operator or user. So it basically is a wrapped runner for the end-to-end test suites. Another aspect is that just because you run the test doesn't mean you have a reproducible artifact, right? Have all the information that any person can take that artifact and then be able to reproduce results in a different environment or a similar environment. So we wanted to make sure that all the metadata that we needed to reproduce the results were contained in that artifact. So in the last release of Sonobui, we basically made a CLI to make it even easier, right? Every iteration is meant to be easier and easier and easier for the people who are using this. So you can basically call Sonobui run. By default, it'll just run the Conformance Test Suite for you. You can do status to see where you are. There's a logs command to get the live streaming logs so you can see what's happening over time. Retrieve to get the tarball output, and delete to clean up after everything else that's left there. We even created a subcommand for E2Es. So if you just want to see failed tests, you can run the Sonobui E2E command, and that will give you the summary results. And you can rerun failed test results if you have a tarball. So if there's a tarball that's there, you can basically call rerun failed on the existing tarball, and it'll selectively re-execute the test that failed. So we try to make it easier and easier with every iteration. So yeah, that's the main gist of the updates for Sonobui and how to run the tests. It's even easier with Scanner. So Scanner is a little SaaS tool we made. So that way you can just copy a single line and run it in your environment, and it'll auto-upload the tarball directly into a little SaaS tool where you can see the results. And you can also just click on download the test report. So if you want to do your conformance testing, you can download from there and then just submit directly. And there's multiple people who have done that as part of their instructions. But the one thing that most people don't really recognize, and let's see if I can get here. No. Oops. Inside of Sonobui, we did an extra step here too. So there's a lot of people and providers who want to do automation, right? And we want to make it easy for them to consume automation and have an ETL process for that tarball, right? So we created a client library to do all the automation that you can run with. So there's an interface that exists now. So if you want to build your own automation to make sure that you're constantly in conformance every time if you're a provider and you're adding extra things or doing other stuff, you now have an interface to kick and do your own automation and ETL process to control this over time. So we made it, again, it's all about making it easier and easier and more automated over time. So that's all I have.
Hi everyone, this is Srini from IBM. I would like to emphasize on the importance of documenting your conformance tests. There is a current document that is available under CNCF website that you can refer to. What I'm referring, I can show you the document at the end. But each test will have a little bit of meta information there, like test name, description, and release information. We have a tool that walks through the Go code and picks up this information or any other comment that is associated with the test. Tests are Ginkgo. It's a conformance hit block that will identify it's a conformance test from the code point of view. So if you have this information, we pick up the information and generate the document. If you don't have this information, essentially we'll be picking up the description part of the describe, context, and the it block, which probably does not make much sense to people who are reading the document and seeing what the test does. So it is important that we should have enough of information as part of each of the tests. I'll show you how, with an example. But all this information is also written into a conformance guideline document that is, there's an open PR on that. It will be available under the contributor section. So just to show you what a test should look like, this is an example of a test that I picked up from the E2E test suite. On the right-hand side, you have all the comments from the source code. There is also meta information there about the test name, description, and the release information. The document that is generated will have the test name, which is linked to the actual source code for that release, for which the document is published, along with all the comment block from the Go, from the test itself is picked up, which is very helpful. Essentially, you are looking at people who are running, don't have to learn Golang, don't have to read through the test code to understand what the test is doing. And the test also calls into Kubernetes code. So all that is going to be very difficult for people to understand. So as much of the documentation that you can provide would really help people understand why the test has failed. That's the whole idea. If I go back to the previous slide, control works here. This is the document I'm talking about. We generated for 1.9. Each of the tests here have some information. That's the documentation that we had at that point in time. Some of the tests have more documentation there. But if you look at any of the tests, you click on them, that should take you to the actual source code. That's pretty much it.
Hi, I'm Mitra from Google.
I'm Aish from Google. Okay. So one of the critical missions in the Conformance Working Group Charter is to increase the code coverage or the testing coverage. Why we want to do that? As of today, out of the 800 plus E2E tests, only 164 are included in the Conformance Suite. So only about 18% of the existing tests are used to certify the different cloud providers. And those are the actual numbers. We have about, in version 1.9, we have 10% coverage for all APIs and 14% for the stable, and 12 and 18% in 110. These numbers are from the API coverage tool, which basically just calculates coverage on the raw and API endpoints alone. The good news is that the trend is going up, but the not so good news is the baseline itself is pretty low right now, and then the rate of growth is not as fast as we want it to be. So what are we doing? One of the goals of the Conformance Working Group is to increase the stable API coverage by 40% by end of Q3, and then increase for the top 3 APIs, get to 80% coverage by end of the year. And how we propose to do this is actually a 3-pronged approach. First is to identify and prioritize the API endpoints that we want to automate. There are a few initiatives around this that Mitra will talk about. The second is collaborate with contracted engineers from a company called Globant. We already have 2 vendors from there who are actively speccing out the test plans and also working on adding these cases to improve the coverage. And 3, enlist collaboration with the SIGs themselves, because they are the authority on what needs to be tested, how it needs to be tested. So we'll be working with them in 2 ways. One is to, first of all, understand what are the existing ETE tests that need to be added to the Conformance Suite. These will be all the GA functionality that's available. And the second part is where are the gaps in the existing tests, and how do we increase coverage for those while exercising meaningful user journeys in doing so. And here are some best practices.
So yeah, when we are adding more conformance tests, here are some best practices we are trying to follow. Basically, communication. We work as a working group, so joining the working group and the Slack channels is important. SIG testing is another SIG we work very closely with, and so they are also code reviewers for most of the code. So joining weekly meetings and the Slack channels is also useful. So for authoring guidelines, we have some loose guidelines around working with the SIGs, like Aish mentioned, to identify test gaps. And there are a lot of tests that we already have in our end-to-end suites, which are actually conformance tests, but they're not marked as such and should be looked at in more detail to identify which of those they are and add them to the conformance suite. And also think about user journey-based testing instead of just the touch points. Kind of think about what is the feature doing or what is the API actually providing when we implement the feature. So like Srinivas was mentioning, using conformance it as the label instead of Ginkgo it, and then verifying that the tests pass on the clusters, and the test should be less than 1% flaky if we're adding them to a conformance suite. Having flaky tests in a conformance suite is no good for anybody. And version conformance tests in the PR as well, and mark them clearly as to which releases. So we do have, in SIG testing, we have a lot of tooling to be verifying flakiness. And we have reports that are published weekly as well. And we send out emails as part of SIG testing for flakiness reports. So keeping a careful eye on that. And if we have flaky tests, more or less instituting some sort of a process to kind of remove them from the suite might be ideal in the future as well. Yeah, you can go ahead. I think, yeah. So when you submit a PR for review, it is necessary to CC the owning SIGs, as well as SIG architecture, because it's a conformance test, and SIG testing. And you need SIG architecture approval to submit, and they have a 2-week SLA to turn around on conformance tests. And where to focus on writing conformance tests? We want to test behaviors of components people are likely to swap out in the open source world, like container runtime, pod networking, kubeproxy, API, server, and scheduler, where people kind of replace it with custom features. Particular effort or attention to pod feature testing, test the open API spec, and as far as possible, the open spec, certain features that are in alpha and beta, which are going to make it to the general availability. And then for certain SIGs, it's also necessary for us still to do some open deep dives, so storage, networking scheduler, open container runtime, CPU memory, and node. These are some of the SIGs we're going to still talk to figure out what are the test cases that need to be extensively covered. This is an active ongoing effort that we are looking into. And also testing and investigating etcd. And here we should be testing the etcd API and not necessarily the internal implementation details of etcd. And conformance tests should not be hitting etcd directly, and we want to make sure that's the case. And most of the tests, we want to make them cloud provider agnostic. So those tests should be passing for all the cloud providers across the board. And we have more details in the deep dive to come as well.
Great. Thank you, everyone, for presenting that introduction. If I could ask all the speakers to actually come back up. And we'll take questions from the audience. So we've been asked for the AV to repeat any questions just for the record. So the question is there a plan to have cloud provider conformance tests?
That's on you.
So probably not by cloud provider, but by groups of functionality. And the working group has actually been tackling this topic, but we haven't yet identified a clear group of functionality that we want to break out separately, but we do expect it will happen. I guess one obvious one could be serverless. So there's a bunch of node tests that may not apply if you don't have nodes, for example. We're kind of waiting for the real need for that, but I think how we'll know when we get there is if someone says, hey, we should be certified, and we're saying that they're not certified, if we look at why that is, and for example, there's a bunch of node tests that just don't make sense anymore. At that point, we'll probably just create like a different profile, which they can then conform to. So that'll probably be how that works. Yeah, good question. Thank you.
I would just add that when we started this a year ago, we thought profiles were going to be essential. And as we kind of move, and we have this like very nice branding and logo process ready to go on it. And as we've moved forward, it hasn't been necessary yet. And so we've just wanted to keep a simpler program if we can. But the obvious one is to the degree going forward that, say, bare metal versus a public cloud had some different set of tests, then we definitely could do profiles, and it would just wind up creating more complexity.
Just a comment on that, and I always feel the need to say it. You always have to remember that the whole purpose of this is so that our users, and there's a lot of them now, right, way more than Seattle and way more whatever, the whole reason we do this is so when I do my stuff and I do it over here, and God forbid I don't like this cloud and I want to go move to this other cloud, everything's going to interoperate, everything's going to work. From an engineering perspective, it sounds so wonderful to have profiles, but understand from the end user point of view, and they take their stuff from here and it goes over there and it now doesn't work. They don't want to hear about how they were the stupid customer, didn't understand that they were two different profiles. All they're going to remember is we lost interoperability. So any day, I sleep well at night every day where the answer is the one that Dan gave, which is we haven't seen the need for this. We added new tests and everybody can pass it. And that's just harmony in my view.
Yeah, I think that's very true, and that's definitely why we haven't been kind of wanting to add profiles. It's just we have that mechanism if we need to avoid kind of a split where someone will be like, hey, you're not conformant, but the community thinks they should be, essentially. I totally agree with you. I think everything should run everywhere. We do have a couple ideas for that as well, like to avoid the predictability problem that you're saying, which is like, hey, like why is my stuff no longer working? I heard a couple ideas. These are just really just in the idea phase, but kind of like a linting tool. So, what if I could like lint my cluster? And so if I'm running on a more expansive profile, can I lint it and actually see like what things are not going to work if I were to move it to a different one? So things like that could be possible in the future if we need. Cool, great question. So the question was, have we seen cases where a test will work on one provider and not on the other, and what approach should we take in that case? Do you want to take that?
For the Conformance Suite, no, because they're the base level API tests. For things like when you start to extrapolate storage, probably. And that's where things will get a little bit weird, and eventually we'll get there. But I think, solve the common base case first and make sure it's good, and then we'll expand in scope. But right now, I think we're on a good trajectory. We've been doing good things. We'll keep going that way, and eventually we'll address those concerns. So like anytime you get to the extension areas between cloud providers is where things are going to get weird and break down.
So the question was, have we seen a case where there was a bug from a particular provider and was actually a bug in the underlying conformance suite?
We did a lot of vetting, and we actually did find bugs in the conformance test suite, and we fixed them. And that was mostly in 1.9, 1.10 range. I think it was we found them in 1.9 and we fixed them in 1.10. But since then, we've got almost zero signal back that people have had failed, actual legit failed conformance tests.
Yeah, and one thing we did is we actually dropped the tests as well until they were fixed, so we didn't kind of disqualify anyone.
And we also have these tests running as CI on some of the clusters on our end, and we monitor them. And so far, we haven't seen any flakes or.
So the question is requirements to get certified.
So essentially, we require you to upload the log results from running Sonobui on your cluster. And so at some point in the future, we could tighten that up and say, we want you to, it has to be a publicly available GA service or something. We pretty explicitly didn't want to do that at launch, and it was very helpful that a ton of companies came out and said, this product's in closed beta right now, but we're passing the test. And there's the subtlety to how the tests work, and again, I think there's some real cleverness to this, is that it is crowdsourced. So yes, I could claim that I have some product that it passes all the tests and fake the logs and upload it, but presumably at some point actual customers are going to go use it and they can run that identical test, and if they don't pass, they can report that to us. And I mean, there's an escalation process. There's plenty of time to look at incompatibilities, but we absolutely could go police cheaters. And then just the technical other pieces. We don't charge separately for certifying, but we do require you to be a CNCF member, and it's $7K a year for a small startup, and we also offer it free for nonprofits, and we do have we call community orgs. So there's this Poseidon, Typhoon, but if there were other community distros, they can all get it for free. So it's definitely designed to be a low, very achievable burden. No, the distinction between public cloud and distribution is we just ask you when you submit, are you hosted, we call it, a distribution or an installer, and you say which of those categories you fit in best. And you're welcome to certify for multiple ones, which several folks have. So, and again, there's no extra charge. I mean, if you wanted to have 10 different versions of your product, you could.
Yeah, and I guess I won't bore you with the details, but it's a very important point about the users being able to test this. And so users can actually initiate a decertification process if there's a failure. So like I said, I won't bore you with all the details, but there's kind of a review period and there's kind of community review as well. So this is about the external API conformance. So you should be able to run it as the user, and if you get different results, then we have a process to handle that. Right. So just to repeat the questions, the question is, if you're self-installing Kubernetes, so is the Conformance Suite kind of a useful tool to verify your installation?
Yes. So for every environment, it's absolutely, I would almost consider it critical to verify that your environment is up to snuff, because if you look at the Slack channel, we get a ton of traffic from people who are basically building their own clusters, and most of the time the way the Conformance Suite is designed to execute, and the way we run it in Sonobui, is we do it in the most non-dramatic, slow fashion possible to make sure that we are getting good signal-to-noise ratio. So if it's failing a test, it's usually failing a test for a good reason. And most of the time, those reasons are configuration problems. Somebody has configured something terribly wrong, or they've done something strange in their initial deployment phase. And surfacing that before you actually deploy applications, I would say is a fundamental step in how you sort of deploy and manage Kubernetes. Sonobui supports plugins. So it was built that way on purpose because we knew providers would want to be able to test their own apparatus or jiggery, because there's no way at this stage that we want to. The Conformance Suite is only a subset of the entire testing range, and we want people to be able to plug in any open source set of tests to either validate workloads or to validate their cluster. So if they want to do extra steps, you can add them via plugins. And again, the API is there and the client tool is there for you to process that in a systematic, programmatic way.
Great. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for, but oh, right. On Friday, we have so later in the afternoon on Friday, if you're interested to really dive into these topics, particularly the improvement of the test suite coverage, please join us. I don't know the exact time, but it's Friday afternoon. 3:40 apparently. So check it out on the schedule. And we have stickers, so don't leave the room without one. Thanks, everyone. Right. Yes, and please join the mailing list as well to participate. Thank you.